All right, so I think we're live. So I'm here with Game Diviner, aka, well, you said I should call you Paulo. I'm going to butcher your name, but is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, this is Paulo. Yes.
Okay, so this is going to be a Saturday night procrastination stream for me. I'm sort of knee deep in school and work, but I definitely want to make time to talk about culture, gaming, and well, generally what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years, I guess.
Oh my goodness.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I know. I think that when I originally started YouTube, and perhaps I can frame this. I know I said this to you which I originally started watching YouTube with Sargon of Akkad. I was curious to see if there's anyone from a Catholic perspective. And you're one of the only people who had a channel. And you were, I think, in the whole Gamergate crowd, but maybe you can explain that a little bit later. And I was very curious about where that would lead. And, basically a year later, I started my channel. And I think there's been sort of a sea change on YouTube and social media since then due to a lot of things that have happened in the culture war. But perhaps you could explain your involvement in social media and this online conversation, and we could start from there.
Sure. Well, about early 2014, I started going on Twitter. The idea, well, at the time, my father had passed away. My daughter was still very young. I was trying to get involved in the independent game community, making my own games. I had tried it one time, and I decided to go make myself a presence on Twitter just so I could encourage people to make games and basically build a bit of a persona. The idea behind a lot of the independent game development at the time was build a persona so people get to know you. So you're not just selling your game, you're selling yourself. And that was the idea. And so I was just starting to get to know people in the independent game community. And what I was saying was encouraging people to say, make a game. And if it's a good game, people will notice. Unfortunately, like in August of 2014, a lot of people found out that wasn't true. That the idea is that people were being kept, I think it's the word, gate kept from actually being discovered by games journalists. And the reason for that is because the games journalists were only covering people that they themselves were personally involved in, financially involved in, romantically involved in. And it became sort of a way
or
of
ideologically involved in.
Oh yeah, definitely ideology involved in that. They just simply prevented anyone who was making a good game from getting into the industry. So it was, from my perspective, the status quo establishment were the critics and this clique of game developers who was working with them. And people, upon discovering that, of course, it made me extremely upset, not only because of the fact that I was telling people that if they made a good game to be discovered, but finding out that it's being, not only just simply the news coverage was being manipulated, but also the award shows. And that was another thing that people don't really talk about, is that there's also some award shows that were being manipulated in the background. And it only just recently came out that Brandon Boyer, he was formerly the head of the Independent Games Festival, the IGF, which was one of the biggest award shows out there. Recently, he was actually one of the people who was accused of sexually harassing people, and people have said that he's been known for years to use his power for sexual favors, and his power being that since he's the leader of all these different award shows, he can make or break your career. And he's one of those male feminist allies that people are talking about. And
this is so strange, right? This sort of fits in. This sort of brings 2014 to 2018, creating sort of the bookends. We have Gamergate, two hashtags bookend this entire process, and I think they're related. We have, on one end, we have Gamergate, sort of the idea of collusion, ideologically motivated. And on the other hand, we have Me Too. And what's so strange is that, you really see there's a story that sort of links the two of them, right? Because with a lot of these allies and these people who are ideologically on the bandwagon, they weren't really commending any kind of personal virtue. And in many times it seemed that their personal virtue, their ideological virtue, was a shield against some really, really terrible practices, both sexually with their colleagues and just purely practicing nepotism.
Yes, and to deflect a lot of the investigation and the people were asking for clarification, rather than simply answering to those allegations, they would deflect by actually accusing everyone else of sexism, everyone else of racism, of transphobia, and all sorts of things. Well, and basically, a lot of people had experienced being blacklisted, or at least even before there was an actual list that we were seeing that people actually were being shut down. No one was going to talk about your games, and if your games were going to come out, they're going to be blasted one way or another for being ideologically wrong, politically incorrect one way or another. There was a lot of that going on early on, and so that pretty much galvanized me as a developer, as a person, to really just stand against this and to speak against it. And it led me all the way up to the point of being at the Society of Professional Journalists in 2015, August 15th, 2015. And there's a lot of reasons I know these dates is because they're very special in my mind. But given also that it was the Feast of the Assumption of Mary, it's kind of hard to forget that. And where I got a chance to, in the crowd, to actually speak up and talk about it. I was actually supposed to be one of the panelists, but they cut down the number of panelists down, so I was second stringer and ended up being in the crowd. But that helped turn around the conversation during Airplay, which is when we were trying to talk to the president-elect Lynn Walsh and clarify, are these things really journalistic malpractice? Because a lot of people were deflecting, saying, oh, it's not malpractice, this is common practice in journalism, et cetera, et cetera. But no, there
was a similar scandal called Journalist, right?
Yes, actually, that's a really interesting thing, because Ezra Klein, who made Journalist, and people are not familiar with that.
Hold on. Before you go on this, let's clarify for our audience. I know what Journalist is. You know what Journalist is. Yes. But we need to clarify this for people who are watching. So this is very similar to Gamergate, and actually happened before Gamergate, where it was discovered that there was it an email list or a Google group? Or something like that.
Some sort of distribution where people could talk to one another and collude, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So what was happening was that journalists were essentially getting together, deciding on common messaging so that they could go out together and come out with a common message. And this is really fascinating, right? Because, I mean, this all throughout this Trump, I don't really like Trump personally. I didn't vote for him, although sometimes, in some ways, I think he might be better than the alternative, but I don't want to comment on that. But since I actually don't even like to think about the choice we were given in the last election, but that's neither here nor there. But regardless, since the election of Trump, we've been hearing independent journalism, again and again and again and again. But as someone from sort of a statistics background, independent journalism means nothing if they're all sitting in a room going, how can we come out with a common headline? That's dependent journalism. That means that we're not getting independent visions. We're getting one vision speaking out of multiple mouths, so that they're not really checking each other. They're just consolidating their message, basically, so they don't have to worry about getting called out.
Yes. And what's interesting is that Ezra Klein, who originated Journalist, is the same person who originated this other list called Game Journal Pros.
Yes.
And the same person actually created them. And Game Journal Pros, if people don't know, is an email list of games journalists talking to one another about how to shape narratives as well. And one person who was on the list actually was disclosed a lot of the conversations that were going on. And the person who reported on it was Milo Yiannopoulos of then Breitbart. The person who was actually part of the list is is William Usher, who is a writer for One Angry Gamer. So he was actually showing that in the background, people were actually talking about this. And among some of the quotes that were there were like, well, who hasn't slept with a PR person? Hashtag am I right? And, were some of the things that they were sharing in the background between these games journalists. And among them, they're talking about, oh, how can we help Zoe and stuff like that. But Zoe Quinn, who was the person who was supposedly accused, but there was a lot of other conversations where people were discovering not just Zoe Quinn. Everyone likes to focus on her, but there was a whole bunch of other developers. And to make the list short, if you ever see what's it called, Indie Game the Movie, no, it's not Indie Game the Movie, excuse me, Rise of the Indies. It's on Steam, and it's a documentary about a whole bunch of game developers called Rise of the Indies. Pretty much everyone in that film are all part of this clique.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is the clique that why I don't want to name names, but see, the thing is, I'm not exactly very familiar with video games, but this practice of consolidating a message before going out and essentially ruining the independent factor of independent journalism or independent media sources is really critical. And I think this probably has to do with the fact that mainstream institutions feel like they're under attack, and getting on message means that they don't have to worry about getting competition, right? That they stay on message. But actually, to bring this back recently, Jordan Peterson. So this is really interesting because it happened just this week, right? Okay, so he was off the left's radar for years. He's been around for like what, a year or two now.
Yeah,
He was
since
off the
C16.
left's radar for years. People didn't. I mean, for a year, or a year and a half. Then he got bumped into a bunch of interviews. The most infamous being the Cathy Newman interview, in which she utterly failed, where she fails to debunk him. But not only does she fail to debunk him, it's obvious that she's purposely trying to misrepresent what he's saying and trying to put words in his mouth. And after that happens, they totally go radio silent on Peterson. And then just this week, not one, but 1, 2, 3 major media broadcasting companies all release exposés that largely involve Jordan Peterson. Mm-hmm. Same week. And at the same time that happens, not one, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 major YouTube channels on the progressive side all release their anti-Jordan Peterson stuff. ContraPoints, 3 Arrows, a bunch of other ones that I'm missing. Like they're all releasing their anti-Jordan Peterson stuff, right? Like clockwork. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And right. It's amazing to me. They must be somehow getting on message and all coming out at once.
Well, there's also well, even with Cathy Newman, if you watch the strategy that they were playing out with her, was that, his fans are harassing her, her fans are attacking her, and he's enabling these people to attack. I mean, the same rhetoric that was used in Gamergate is exactly there too. It's like, it wasn't criticism of a particular person for doing a particularly bad thing. It's criticism of all women, or all women want to be kicked out of gaming, which is frankly ridiculous and also impossible.
No. I mean, it's kind of a ridiculous thing, but this has sort of been the MO. The MO is to find some reason to disqualify your opponent so you don't have to answer their arguments. It seems that this has been sort of a tactic that's come from these people continuously, is they don't want to have arguments because arguments are scary, or they don't want to have discussions because discussions are scary. There could be points that could be brought up that they might not be able to answer. And once you can't answer them, that vindicates your opponents. And the question, it's sort of a chicken and the egg argument: which came first, the wall or this tactic? But I think it's the wall. They're trying to essentially justify a reason why they're not communicating with independent game developers, independent journalists, bloggers, or YouTubers. They're trying to justify their exclusion, right? And their exclusion relies on them being able to have a microphone and say, you have all these negative properties about you that disqualify you from this platform. So if they get into an argument, that's scary to them because they could possibly lose. And once they lose, it vindicates that person's presence as part of the platform. So they have to come up with all these other reasons. And this means that they have to all be on message. They all have to say the same thing. They all have to vindicate the various criticisms again and again and again, right? You can't have self-contradictory criticism, so they all have to be on message.
It's called the narrative.
Yeah, exactly. They have to get on narrative.
Right.
And yeah.
And go ahead. Well, it's more of like the fact that they have a narrative structure of a story that they need to tell, and they all need to tell the same story. Anyone who talks about either a contravening or parallel story or a more nuanced story, they cannot let on the air. That's really the thing. It's that there's in a sense, what I see the culture war as is it's a war of stories. And that's really the main issue. And the main story of the left is oppression narrative, basically the Marxist message. And anyone who gets outside of that, around it, or nuances it is a very dangerous person. That's what Jordan Peterson actually, in a sense, represents. He's the person who's actually able to explain it in a much broader, much more subtle, more nuanced context that people can actually talk to one another. And that's what makes him so dangerous.
It's kind of funny. I mean, the narrative, it is a Marxist narrative fundamentally. I mean, it's transmogrified itself so it can be comfortable with corporatism, which is kind of insane if you think about it from classic Marxism. But that's essentially what's happening. You have you've got these basically these diversity consultants working for multinationals, parroting points that were developed originally by people who are ex-Stalinists.
Most of these communists are not really even are the best capitalists in the world. They think about money more than capitalists.
Yeah. Well, this is why I don't like the word capitalism. I mean, I think it's sort of confusing, right? A market can be a useful tool. It can also be an incredibly corrupted tool.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, so the I feel capitalism kind of, if I defended capitalism, would I be defending the abuses of the market? You know, so I feel it's oftentimes it kind of creates more confusion than it does insight.
Well, that's where the story needs to be more nuanced. The idea of like having this smaller story, very simple for people to jump on a bandwagon. I think that's also where a lot of people, I think this is where I think it goes into wider geek culture, is that people really need a story to latch onto. People need something to give them meaning, and stories are what drives meaning. And I think one of your people here in the chat was asking if anyone saw like Jordan Peterson. I actually saw him just yesterday, and I was telling you about it in the DC one. But one of the things that Dr. Peterson was presenting is that people, in order to understand themselves, need to see themselves inside their own story to know what heroic archetype, what story are you telling? Are you telling a tragedy because of what you're doing with your life? Or are you going to tell eventually a story of triumph and heroism, which is what we're all called to be? And the problem is that most people don't understand their own stories. They don't know where they are, who they are, and in the wider culture, what the story of the culture is. And what Dr. Peterson's presenting, which has made a lot of not only just simply the leftists, but also skeptics very scared, is that he presents an ancient story that we've been telling for generations of us talking about the divine individual, the logos, and how we are a part of it. And I think that in geek culture, the reason why it's been a surge, and we were talking about this in your geek culture videos, there's been a surge of it, especially in the modern era, is because a lot of our grand narratives of how we understand civilization, our stories of how we came to be as a people, how we came to be as a culture, have largely been destroyed, either by, the destruction of World War II, where we've completely lost faith in ourselves and our culture and our countries and our ideologies. And so people have sort of come back to two major parts, which is the fantasy. Fantasies being a new retelling of our ancient history in a mythological sense, and then sci-fi, which is how we view ourselves in the future, how we transcended our past mistakes and become something greater, such as Star Trek and all the other different sci-fi things. So the two different narratives have become the staples of geek culture because we're not sure what to think of our own culture in our own time. And that's why I think it's been such a surge in the last half of the 20th century.
I mean, that is true. I mean, we lost sort of transmitters that were more classical, and we replaced them with popular culture. But luckily enough, popular culture has enough of the old wisdom that it might be able to, actually transmit some wisdom to us.
Yes, and the wisdom being like, who we are as a people. So Now, I think the consumerism, which you were very critical of in your videos, I actually see it as a very different view on it, and why people are very, in a sense, driven to buying all the different paraphernalia is, if you think about, in a sense, what real religion is a grand story of how we came to be as a people, how we came to be as a culture. It's a grand narrative. And for the most part, most religions have physical manifestations of that particular story, whether it be art, architecture, clothing, and the way we organize ourselves as a society. So geek culture, in a sense, being a replacement of the grand narrative because we're not sure who we are, necessarily needs also physical, in a sense, sacraments and sacramentals, things that you can physically touch to be part of this culture. So people necessarily need it. And unfortunately, because we live in a sense, a post-Protestant, post-iconoclast kind of society, which kind of says, oh, it's all about ideas and, what you think and believe. And we kind of deny the physical aspect that we need. People don't quite see how much they really need a physical manifestation of a culture they're celebrating or a story they're celebrating. They want to be part of the story in some way, so they have to have a story, like they have to have the sword of Aragorn, or they have to have a statue of this anime character they want. And it's not, it's not in a sense, because I think you're critical of it being just simple consumerism, but no, it's a hunger for a physical object that's part of this story that I want to be part of, the part that is that speaks to me. So that's what they're trying to do. Is they're actually trying to find a something physical you can touch, because we're bodies more than we are just simply ideas and beliefs.
I mean, that's what definitely nerd culture aspires to be, a new culture. It aspires to preserve something and carry it forward into a new age. And I think that this is sort of the challenge, because I've been reading Patrick Denon's Why Liberalism Fails, and he describes sort of the modern culture we have today as not being a culture, but being an anti-culture. it's sort of a solvent that breaks down things that are long lasting and that have roots that go back to our ancestors. And because of that, we're sort of left trying to scrape something together from these pieces, right? And that's sort of the challenge that I think we're really dealing with, is that I do see nerd culture as sort of the beginning of something, but I think that it needs to sort of be taken in a new direction, in a direction that is more challenging, I guess, or something.
Yeah, the issue is like, it's more of, I don't think it's more of it needs a new direction. I think it more needs to know what it's grounded in. Why are we doing these things? Mm-hmm. Why are we so interested in it? Because once you find out why we're so interested in these stories, is because, like, we need to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And unfortunately, the only story that people are selling, and this is what the news is doing, is that you're part of the oppression narrative. That's the only narrative that's out there. And anyone what Fox News and the right tries to sell is the American story, which is, the manifest destiny kind of story, where American triumphalism and American pride. But anyone who knows the story knows it's a very nuanced story, which has a lot of, like, both light and dark parts. So there's a lot of criticism against it by the left, and unfortunately the right is not able to simply, like, answer it. And a lot of the white nationalists who are talking about it, and or even the South will rise again kind of types, kind of try to whitewash it, try to remove the parts of it that that are very dark and subtle. So you have to understand history from the perspective of it being being very nuanced. And unfortunately, I think this also has to do with our very Protestant background in the United States. Mm-hmm. The idea that if we simply create a society that's perfect, or at least has the right rules, or even a Christian society, whatever that means, we will eventually reach the utopia where everyone will be great and society will be wonderful. But as Catholics, we know that's not true. And even if everyone was Catholic, we know that society itself you have to be patient with. And we even know from our own background that Christ himself said that his kingdom will have both, wheat and weeds, right? So we have to be patient with the way the world is going to be. And rather than simply trying to run away and create a utopia, whether it be a Christian nation or, like, a secular nation where you don't have to worry about, religion coming in, or, the feminist one where you have to destroy gender and everything like that. We know that those things are false, no matter if you're right or left. Mm-hmm. So,
well, it's hard to know where to begin, right? Because we have the problem that institutionally, and I've become rather black-pilled about this. I mean, the progressive forces, well, okay, I mean, some people, I've been highly critical of the alt-right because I'm anti-racialist in perspective, and I think that it needs this religious perspective you're talking about. But recently, an alt-righter did come up with a rather black-billed criticism of Jordan Peterson. And I kind of want to throw it out to challenge us here. And
sure,
because Peterson was like, well, he was talking about how, all these contradictions in gender ideology, all these conflicting interests in the left's racial ideology, determining who's the oppressed. And he's like, well, how are you going to answer that? And the alt-right critic was like, well, we've established, based on the last 20 years, that the left functionally does not have to answer these things. It's able to essentially conquer institutions, even thoroughly conquer institutions. And I'll use my own native state of California as an example. It's able to totally dominate the entire apparatus through and through of an entire state, from the corporations that operate there to the governmental institutions, with this ideology. And it will never have to answer questions about, are all non-white people equally oppressed? If Asians are oppressed, then why do we discriminate against them in colleges? All these contradictions, they functionally don't have to be answered. And so, the issue I think that we're staring down right now is that, give what we have, the answers that we have to Jordan Peterson has for the left are very true. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they're not sans some more radical approach to these issues. They don't seem to be something that really, they're embarrassing for the left. Don't get me wrong. They are thoroughly embarrassing, and the left is afraid about being embarrassed. But they're not embarrassing enough to really challenge the ascendancy of the forces that we're talking about, if that makes sense.
In such as the I mean, I don't actually quite understand what the argument is from the right, though.
So, well, if you're from a radical position, you'd be like, okay, well, the left does not have a coherent ideology on gender or race. It doesn't. Like, and I could just sit here all day, and Jordan Peterson does this too, just pointing out the contradictions.
Right.
But the thing is that it's not like the left just got an incoherent idea on race and gender. Like, it just developed it in the last 3 years. The left hasn't had a coherent vision on race and gender for the last 25 years. Yet all throughout this period where it's had this incoherent notion of race and gender, it's essentially been able to use slogans generated from this perspective to gain additional power in places where it's been politically dominant. And this, so it's not sufficient to just simply call out the contradictions to get rid of this ideology, I guess. That's the point.
I agree, and you have to present actually, in a sense, something foundational. That's something that I think that that Sargon and many other skeptics are kind of missing, is that they present, of course, the counter argument, but they do not also present a foundational one.
Well, what is a foundational one in a place that looks like the modern West Coast? That's kind of, it's like, the elites don't believe in Christianity.
No, they don't.
We have a number of, I mean, it's not even as bad as it is in Europe, but we have a number of cultures that are very different from each other. And although on the West Coast of America, there's a lack of animosity among certainly a good deal of the cultures, right? I'd say this definitely doesn't hold out in some areas, but it's still not exactly clear whether you can. It's so easy to make some kind of unified, on a societal level, some kind of unified notion of commonality or of common culture among that situation.
That's where geek culture actually applies and also appeals to many people, is that it steps outside, in a sense, the religious lines, even though, in my opinion, they're actually very much religious in structure. They try to actually, approach the idea of how you're supposed to be in the world. They tell you how you're supposed to act, and people from all sorts of different cultures can actually gravitate to many of these stories. The issue, I think, and that's why, in the sense, the SJWs are trying to get into geek culture, is that they fundamentally have an issue with the heroic journey. The heroic journey being the person who, forthrightly goes into the world and takes up a challenge and grows and necessarily may even die to themselves and others and to be reborn, is what the story that Dr. Jordan Peterson speaks about in Archetypes, which are foundational to our society and go all the way back thousands and thousands of years. So from that perspective, like, that's why we tell these stories over and over again, and why geek culture is so popular. But then you have the SJW incursion, which is, no, all you need to do is show up and you're good as you are. And that's what you see being played out in the Star Wars stories with Rey and the quote unquote Mary Sue. Jonathan Padgett does a great job of this on his channel about dissecting what the Mary Sue is. And that the idea is that you come in and you're as good as you are and you're all powerful as you are and everyone likes you as you are, and there's no heroic journey. You know, in the movie, especially with The Last Jedi, Rey doesn't have a beginning, she doesn't have an end. She just naturally shows up. She's already better than her master. She's already perfectly balanced in the Force.
And there's no looming threat either, right? I mean, like, right. They didn't even like, there was some idea in the previous one that they would build like the Snook guy or whatever, Darth Gollum, as they call him, into some kind of villain with menace, right? But at this stage, you have the villain that Rey is possibly going to face off in the next movie. He's a villain that really only has ever failed. Yeah, right.
All of them have already failed.
Yeah, and then he gets humiliated in front of his men by Luke Skywalker, right? So Luke doesn't even. I mean, Luke dies kind of conveniently by the mechanisms of the plot, but he ends up kind of owning Kylo Ren. So Kylo Ren enters into the next part of the series with absolutely no menace whatsoever. Who could be afraid of Kylo Ren?
He's laughable. People laugh at him as some sort of like emo. I mean, every male figure.
It's a joke.
Every male figure in the whole story, if you look at it, is simply, destroyed. The hotshot pilot is being made up because he thinks with his cockpit kind of thing, which is what Leia says, and all sorts of like male bashing in it, and the heroic journey is simply taken apart. And of course the critics loved it and the fans hated it because the fans actually know what a real story is. And
because like how did the characters develop, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the arcs were literally subverted, right? Like the arcs of what is the hotshot pilot supposed to learn in the next one, right? To not take risks, like, but in that case, what is his role going to be? Is he going to like retire his X-wing and become like the secretary of Princess Leia? Like, is that
no? It's not about like. It's not about destroying the things that you hate, but about helping those people that you love, which is what Rose was saying. I'm like, wait a minute, what?
It doesn't even have a coherent vision of sacrifice, right? Because it asks us to applaud a sacrifice one character makes, right?
But not the other.
Not the other, and it's hard to say like how is the sacrifice any different? It's almost an identical sacrifice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's almost identical. The only thing different is the demographic qualities of the characters involved, right?
Yeah,
it's kind of funny because I think that Rose is sort of a bizarre character, right? Because in the initial, like, you see her sister, and if this were done on the previous era of Star Wars, her sister would have been the major character, and she would have developed into an arc, right?
That's right.
But Rose doesn't have an arc. She has a message that she's going to deliver to the audience,
and the message is about like anti-capitalist when they arrive on the planet. And I'm like, so
anti-capitalist. It's like it's this idea that like that certain characters are virtuous and certain characters are not virtuous based on
gender.
Based on some kind of properties they have external to the plot, right?
Well, yeah. That's where I think like a lot of people, I think this is also where I think that a lot of people are going to shift over, is that they realize that they're not being told stories, they're being told propaganda. And that's also something that a lot of the Christian movies also suffer from. If you ever watch any of them, it's like they don't tell a story, they tell propaganda. Everyone who's a Christian is good, everyone who's not a Christian is bad. There's no subtlety to it, there's no character development. I even likened it to calling it Christian porn, because that's basically what it is.
Yeah. I mean, the left has essentially fallen into that, which is kind of amazing.
Right.
I mean, this is it is really amazing. I mean, considering it's not like the Mary Sue is an archetype that hasn't been explored. I mean, one of my favorite movies in high school was I'm going on a digression. It was Princess Mononoke, right?
Yeah.
And the main character, the male main character, is a total Gary Sue. I love the movie still, but he has no arc, right? The arc actually occurs in the other characters on the side, right? Like actually, it's kind of funny because the female characters actually have an arc and change. Even the female villain does, but the main character doesn't. Maybe the movie or not, right? But
I've seen Princess Mononoke. I do think he does have a little bit of a. Well, then again, you're right. He did. What is his transformation?
He doesn't have one. The other characters do, right? But looking
Gary
back,
Stu. Gary Stu.
I watched it over again and I'm like, this is a major plot flaw, but it still survives it, right? Miyazaki himself as a creator has enough awareness to know that he can't hang the movie on that. He has to make the movie about the peripheral characters, right? Yes. And so it can be, even if though there's a Gary Stu in the movie, he can kind of be a point of view camera that captures the struggles and arcs, the small struggles and arcs that the other characters do, right? And I think the movie still works because of that, right?
Yes.
But I guess this is sort of the difficulty we're dealing with is that I think that the left is sort of it's become totally has lost any self-awareness, and I'm not so sure how it regains that.
I don't know if it can. I mean, I think it needs to play out because in the sense the right had played itself out and it still has extreme elements, but we actually know where the line is drawn, especially when it comes to racial superiority and whatnot. We still have to go on the bounds of the individual, which is where the racial end is completely off. On the equity end, which is the left, where everyone has equal outcome, we are starting to play that out, and we have to let people see it for what it is. And I think the best way to show the archetypes, I think, is that, you know, everyone loves to cite the Harry Potter thing, but, you know, you have Voldemort. Voldemort is, you know, the racial superiority type, pure blood. He's the right. But then the person who people hate more than Voldemort, the most hated character in the whole story, is, you know, Dolores Umbridge. And Dolores, because Dolores Umbridge, because, you know, with Voldemort, you have his evil is, you know, this is will to power. I'm gonna do what I want. Well, Dolores says, I'm doing it for your own good. And
that was the weirdest part about this new Star Wars movie. Like, because Umbridge was a good character reference, right? Is that it literally made the audience hate that Admiral What's-Her-Face character.
Admiral Tumbler?
Yeah.
Holdo.
Admiral Holdo. I called her Admiral Gender Studies. By the way, the actress who plays her is a good actress. She really, she didn't deserve this, right?
Yeah, she did.
But it's a terrible character, and it's really like it's really strange because they invite you to hate her, and then when you hate her, the movie turns around and lectures you. Right, which is really strange, right? And it's not even clear, like, why you should have hated her to begin with, right? Like, nothing external was given. It wasn't really a twist in the classic sense, right? It just seemed that, like, you know, oh, you shouldn't question this person, not because she did something inherently, you know, that was right, but rather than she was who she was, right?
Right. I mean, I think they're trying to set it up where, like, the people question her because she was, you know, you should always trust her, because then they want to set up where people distrust her because she's a woman.
Yeah,
but she's a terrible commander. She's a terrible commander, though.
They were self-conscious enough to know they couldn't do that explicitly, right? But that was the implicit stuff behind the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Behind the whole thing was that, you know, that was the only way to explain why, you know, she acts like a tyrant in the first part, you know, but we're wrong to oppose it. She sacrifices herself in the second half, and we're supposed to applaud her for that. But then when the character does the same thing, we're supposed to not applaud him for that. No, this is the narrative. Like, the only thing left is not really the substance or the essence of what the characters do, but really their external forms, right? Mm-hmm. So we get a morality play where we're trying to associate with what the characters are, how we should be reacting to them, not what they do in the story, which is really weird.
And I think that's where the left will eventually lose, is when you really play out their grand narrative, you really look at it. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't. There's a lot of holes in it, and anyone with any sense of what what the real story is about humanity and how we're supposed to be, will eventually pick it out. And that's where we have that culture war that's happening on the geek level, because we know what the way the stories are. We know how we have to be as human beings. We have to go through that transformation process of dying to ourselves and rising again and becoming stronger as we do so, practicing these little things along the way, little acts of heroism, until we're called to the bigger ones.
So this is the thing, because I don't think, I've said it in other videos, I don't think that the left and right are symmetrical forces. I see the left like a rubber band that's being pulled back until it snaps, and the right being the reaction against that. But what I think the right has happened is that, you're right, the right has essentially died. But in its death, it's become this really weird reactionary force. And it's, in some sense, discovered new strength there, which is really weird. And so I guess I'd like to be hopeful about the future, but I think we're headed for a rebirth of fire. And the fire might come from the right. But the right is currently now fomenting a counterculture.
Do you think it's actually, cohesive? Because I just still don't think it is. I mean, most people don't even know how to define themselves as alt-right, and most of the people I know who, are starting to really react against this HW stuff are not necessarily buying into the fact that the alternative that is the alt-right, that is, race nationalism of some sort, is the answer.
Oh no, it's not the answer. Race nationalism can't be the answer.
Right. And you've outlined it very well in your series about like how it falls apart.
No, it will totally fall apart. But it's this is sort of a thing I said about Sargon's liberalist project, liberalistism, or whatever Sargon calls it. That can't possibly be the answer too. But these are sort of necessary failures that need to be made in order for us to kind of burn away certain misperceptions we've had about society, right? So the right has discovered that platitudes about, you know, liberalism being or globalistic capitalism being a perfect system are not going to cut it, or platitudes about how we can go back to the 50s aren't going to cut it. And they have also discovered the necessity of culture and the sort of futility of playing a political game against a cultural foe, which has essentially led to the destruction of the Republican Party. But that now they're sort of going to the next easiest thing, and the easiest identity is a racial identity. Now, I think that is going to flare up and have failings, but I think every time the alt-right's going to essentially form and fail and form and fail. But each time it forms and fails, I think people are going to learn something, right?
I think Sargon's
and then a new force will essentially, and the same thing true with Sargon. Sargon's liberalism project is going to form and fail. But I think that every time it forms and fails, people are also going to learn. And from those two failures, you're going to see construction of a new right-wing reaction that's going to be comprised of the learnings of those two forces.
And hopefully the learnings will be correct in the sense of just simply repeating errors of the past. In the sense, I think Sargon's error is that he's trying to pick up in a sense where the Enlightenment left off. And
the Enlightenment didn't leave off anywhere in particular. It just kind of
yeah, I know. And unfortunately, like, so, you know, history went on beyond the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment project being, you know, we're going to take the roots of Christianity of the divine individual, but we're going to sweep away all the mythological things and see if it holds up. And
we tried that. We've totally tried.
Yes, and that's why I think Sargon's like 400 years a little late.
Well, no, I mean he's ignoring that Nietzsche and these radical critiques of the Enlightenment that existed in the 19th century didn't happen. Mm-hmm. Right.
That's why I don't think the skeptics are going to get anywhere. I mean, like, they have the right ideas,
mm-hmm.
but they don't know the metaphysics underneath it that actually are the bigger story, which I think is where Jordan Peterson picks up really well, is that, you know, he says that these are age-old ideas that have been going on for centuries. The mythology underneath it, as well as the metaphysics underneath it, are necessary for us to understand the way the universe is. And what people don't understand either is that it's the foundations of science, that we rely on a universe that's reliable, you know, testable, because we believe in a rational universe made by a rational God. That's the foundation of science. I mean, that's the metaphysics behind it, is that the universe is understandable because the creator of it is understandable. And people kind of forget that, the whole story behind that whole thing, and they just want to skip over to the end and, you know, get rid of all the religious stuff because we want to get away from the wars of the Protestants and Catholics, which we're slowly starting to resolve through dialogue and talking nowadays, to realize what are our differences and why did we go wrong, and where are we talking? Actually, people are actually talking about it nowadays. I mean,
see, I think that this is going to be a learning on the right. I genuinely believe that the solution is going to come from the right. I think that the creative destruction is going to come from the left, but the ideas are going to be born out of a friction between the liberalist communities and the reactionary communities, right?
Yeah.
And I think the only option is going to be some rediscovery of spirituality.
And honestly, I have a sense that this actually will come from gaming, and this is where I've sort of
developed. That's fascinating.
I think that's where I come up with this idea, and it's really kind of crazy. So I want to see if this actually sticks anywhere.
Go! You've certainly caught my attention.
Because the way that gaming works, right? This is something I've found it through Jordan Peterson's, like, you know, lectures, and this is where I draw a lot from it, is that he says that the maximal point of meaning is where you're on the edge of chaos and order, where you're doing a high performance sport, when you're dancing, when you're listening to music and dance, and, you know, listening to it and it's pounding, and you're actually at the edge of that of chaos and order, where you have your skills, but you're actually going on the edge, where you're working at, you know, at your maximal capacity at a job. You know, and when you're there's a lot of moments in your life when time disappears because everything just seems to be flowing correctly. And one of the times that actually happens a lot is gaming, right? Gaming is known phenomenon where it's one of the easiest ways to create something they call flow.
Yeah.
So I had to ask, like, is this really a place of meaning? Because a lot of gamers and game developers have a lot of anxiety that what they're doing is they're wasting time. But as I started thinking about it, maybe it's not, because what you're doing when you're playing a game is that you create goals for yourself, or at least the game presents you with goals. It presents you with feedback, and it gives you a system of rules to understand how the world works. And you're the thing in the world which creates either order out of chaos or creates chaos and tyrannical order. You're one or the other. And so you are living as an incarnation in this microcosm as the logos. And the identification with this state of being is so strong that people unconsciously know this is an identity. So they identify as gamers because they identify, especially people who play games that have a dying and rising hero. So because there's a dying and rising hero, and they're identifying as gamers, they're actually identifying as like a mini logos. And that's what a gamer is. And what Dr. Peterson's doing is that he's actually presenting the 4 fundamentals of a game that applies to real life. When he says life is a game or life is a series of games, it took me a little bit to realize he's actually proposing it as this is metaphysically true. That one, you have to look at life as a challenge, as your cross to bear, as it's not just simply running away from the world and it's being shoved onto you as a burden, but to look at it as a moment of where you can take the heaviest load and turn life into glory through your effort, with God, as a manifestation of the divine logos, because you're a son and child of God, right? So that's the first thing he says is like, this is rule. He's not saying it out loud, but okay, the first thing is you have to accept a challenge mentality. 2, you have to accept that you have to have goals, a direction. And the thing is, people don't set goals and directions for themselves. And once you start doing that, you have a pathway to go forward. And then you have to be honest and truthful so you can see the feedback coming at you. And because if you're honest and truthful, as well as you pay attention, life is constantly giving you positive and negative feedback about how you're supposed to do things. I had a friend of mine who said to me, I wish that we had, level up indicators and like other things that games have. So I know my life is like, is opening up as it's progressing. I said, but yes, you do. But you have to set goals. So you're actually failing them or you're actually progressing on them. Or if you're aiming at the right thing or the wrong thing, and you have feedback. You have friends to tell you with this feedback. You have family telling you this feedback. You have yourself to tell yourself. But you have to be honest and accept the feedback. I mean, we know gamers who are very, who hate feedback they get when they play their games. Lastly, there are rules to life. You have to know that what the rules are, what the proper goals to set, and so he outlines a whole bunch of rules. If you really look at it. And this is the fundamental structure of every religion. It's a game. The 4 corners are a challenge mindset, goals, rules, feedback. And this is the definition of a game through someone I've been reading, is Jane McGonigal, who's a game designer, as she's explaining how to actually improve people's lives by turning them into games. Yeah. And I'm like, so really, if the gamers, if they realized what they were doing was actually practicing being, in a sense, a small microcosm of what the logos is, of what Christ is, and they take that and they incarnate it in their real life, it could make a serious, tremendous difference if they actually realize that what they're doing is practicing proper being in video games, which is why they're so meaningful, why they're so, in a sense, why people are so more obsessed with them in their real life is because it's a microcosm of the way they're really supposed to be. So you take that and you apply it to the larger world.
That's interesting.
I think that people just need to be more aware of it. That's what they're doing.
Well, it would involve a radical changing of the gaming landscape, I think, though.
I don't know. I think it just needs to be more explicit. I mean, Jane McGonigal is actually trying to tell people more about this through a couple of her books. But for her, like what she's missing, what Jane McGonigal is missing, she says reality is broken. I don't think it is. I think reality, the problem is us, is that we don't want to set goals for ourselves because we don't want to fail. And we're not honest with ourselves because we don't want negative feedback. But if we are really honest and we practice honesty, which is what many of the things we do are supposed to do at religion, which is like confession and all sorts of things, are supposed to make us be truthful to ourselves about the negative things we do so we can correct ourselves and set our goals properly. It becomes a game. And basically we become little children in the large house of God, because we're playing games with one another. And so long as we're all playing the same game, we're all on the same page, we can all have fun. Mm-hmm. once you're playing a game and these systems get tighter and tighter together, you experience flow. You experience a point where you're between order and chaos and creating things out of chaos and taking down tyrannies. It's the imitation of Christ. So when I started looking at that, I'm going, is this a crazy theory? Does it sound like it actually has something that could work if it's explained correctly and maybe more explicit in one way or another?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting theory, certainly, and I think there's certainly something there, right? There's something, there's something inside games. I don't really play a lot of video games. I'm more of a board game person, but I think there's something to what you're saying. I think that there's no way to save ourselves from some kind of radical shift that's coming down the line.
Yes,
and I think that this is. I think that the cultural things that we develop right now are going to be helpful, but they're not going to push things forward past where we need to be. But anyway, I have to get going. I think we should answer super chats. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about before we signed off?
Well, there was a couple of questions I saw in the live chat. One of them was like, what's the difference between Protestants and Catholics? I think really the main thing, like just in terms of narrative, is that the Catholic narrative is that we have a broken world and we're supposed to work within this particular system. We're going to have a broken hierarchy. We're still going to work with it. And we have to painfully progress through it, even though we have an organization that tries to work and help the world. There are going to be bad people and good people in it. And the Protestant narrative is, no, we're going to find a way to make a system that actually works and get away from all that. And unfortunately, that mindset means you're going to break away from this group, which has horrible people in it, which means you break away from that group, which has horrible people from it. We break away from that group, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, they want to finally arrive at a point where, somehow we have a perfect nation based on the fact that we've broken far away enough from all these people who are bad. And we know that is never going to work. So if you really the idea at least for the Catholics is work within this broken system, be the right person in it, and you'll be the agent of change. And that's what the narrative of many saints are, that you're going to be the person who can fix a system from within, no matter how pathological it can get. And that's really what Christ also does. He doesn't simply abolish the law; he fulfills it. So, I mean, there are probably other chats there too, but let's see what else we can.
No, I think that's. There's a bunch of joke chats and then a bunch of. I have to read these chats even though they're ridiculous. So the first one by Pragmatic Culture for $10. Thank you. Can you eliminate nerd culture by curing incels, or will you cure incels by eliminating nerd culture? Well, that's an odd thing, is that we've kind of gone bonkers over this incel thing in the last week because of that attack in Toronto.
Yeah.
And this, to my mind, I think the left has gotten into the bad habit by trying to politicize the motives behind these mass shootings.
In my opinion, it's just another way to attack geeks and gamers. I mean, nerds, basically. It's like a new way of calling out nerd. Like, the nerd you'd call is the person who's so, he's got all these pimples and, is totally socially inept. You don't think he's ever going to have a girl. So you make fun of him, call him a nerd. That's what you used to do. Now they just have a different word for the same thing.
There was this activist, Ellen Powell, who was tweeting out, he said, Silicon Valley companies, you almost certainly have incels working for you. What are you going to do about it? I mean...
Well, she's not just an activist. She used to be the CEO of Reddit.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's bizarre. But yeah, I mean, she used to... I mean, what... This is sort of kind of almost farcical. I mean, incel just means you're involuntarily celibate. I mean, I guess hopefully you'd be voluntarily celibate would be a better way of going about it. But I don't know if you're really going to crack down on guys for not having girlfriends.
There's also a bit of the, unfortunately, the oppression narrative that people have taken on, that I'm oppressed because people don't want me. And so, I mean, really, it's a pushback against both the victim mentality from within side, but from the outside, it's also like, are you really going to, make fun of people for not having a girlfriend, for being a virgin, for whatever? It's like, God, I thought we were over that. Now we're back again, just different words,
Yeah. I'll read the other super chats obligatorily. LM for $2. Thank God for super chats, so I can say, shut up, Pag. Thank you, I guess. LM for another $2. I can't wait till atheist Peterson is frying in hell. I don't think Jordan Peterson's an atheist. I think he's a deist, but
either way, even as Catholics, we don't believe necessarily that someone has to be explicitly saying, I believe Jesus is my Lord and Savior for them to go to heaven. It's like we as Catholics, we don't make that distinction that, oh, you have to say the magic words of I believe, and it's more of what you do, and it's between you and God, really.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't Calvinism, right? This is
definitely not.
The I always go back to Dante, who has he has his rules, but he always kind of cheats on them. He has a virtuous pagan in heaven. So Cato the Elder, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
But
I don't think JP's Gnostic either, guys. I mean, people say, "Oh, he's Gnostic." No. Gnostic people tend to also disembody themselves.
Yeah,
like he's very much about the body, which is very, in a sense, almost if he actually, I think, read the theology of the body and understand, because what he does is what Peterson's doing is actually merging, in a sense, biological psychology with the theological. If he read the theology of the body, he'd know he's right on track. So I think he's on the right direction. It's just a matter of time and grace. And in many ways, I think he's being withheld faith, not for us, for our sake or his sake, but really for the people who listen to him. Many people who are on the edge of faith, and I think that's actually that actually is God's grace working in him to, in a sense, keep him away from the faith for a while longer, because he certainly is inviting a lot of people who are on the fence.
Yeah, I think it's hopeful, though. Like I said, I think that something radical needs to come in addition to all of the good cultural work that Jordan Peterson and others are doing. I think that's helpful, but I think that we're going to breed a catalyst in the counterculture that is going to shake things up at a more deep level. But just to finish out the super chats here, Catholic Wench, my lovely fiance, has just donated $5 Canadian. Well, thank you. Everyone should check out her channel. She has a funny video on Jacqueline Glenn that she made this week. I swear I have no input into her content, but it's really good. It's certainly funnier than my channel is. I'm dour, and people say they get depressed watching my channel.
maybe you should give less black pills and more hopeful things, because really it is. I think it's a more hopeful time than people think. I mean, we have a lot of good that's going to happen. I think it's just
I personally, my hope is that I'm hoping that a poetic counterculture is going to spring forward. That eventually that the internet's still in its nascent phases, and soon what we'll see is that people who meet on the internet and have a common ideological vision will be able to meet up and explore deeper things, create societies where they can go hiking together, where they can pursue artistic endeavors at a much deeper level, where they can form into parish communities. And from that, we might get a revitalization.
I think that a good parallel would be the iconoclast heresy, because if you look at the SJWs in a sense of iconoclast, they take the icons of the culture and they smash it down, and they want, because of patriarchy and other reasons, and the heroic myths and stuff are all trash. In the aftermath of that was a great flourishing of art and revival. So I think that's a good way. I think it's a good way to look at it. And if we recapture the goodness and show this is what civilization was built on, and really revive that, and get away from the in a sense the faith only Protestantism that doesn't want to do physical things. I think once we revive the culture and the arts, it's going to be something quite to see. And I think that will have to come from, in a sense, the Catholic Orthodox end, who are and people, Christians, who know that the faith is more than just simply belief in your mind. It actually is a physical thing you have to touch and taste, and that's going to completely and totally change everything.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I'm hoping that this next iteration of the internet will be able to undo the damage that social media has done. Mm-hmm. Right? The internet 1.0 was, hey, we have email, but nothing works because everything is transient. Internet 2.0 was social media essentially fixes internet 1.0, but turns us into virtue signaling zombies who can't have intelligent conversations because everyone's just a talking head that we can immediately delete. And internet 3.0 was the communities that started on the internet can actually become thick and enter into meat space. That things on the web, things on the net can actually flower into real communities. And if we can accomplish that, I think there's real hope.
And I think as you as a YouTuber are part of it. I think you're a great part of it because, especially you're just having discussions with people. And I mean, that's really the difference. Like with tweets and with Facebook, it's text. It's all inside your head. It's not embodied. But when you speak, it's different. And I think that's where I think you can make a big difference, especially with your channel and all the other YouTubers. And even, and then it's even more so, especially when you saw in the aftermath of like people actually talking and facing one another and all these other YouTube community when they were doing, I forget what it was, but they were all physically together. Even people who are ideologically opposed to one another saw the humanity because they're actually physically together, and that's where a lot of this I think can make a difference. So
it would be really weird if I could meet some of the people who I've had disagreements with, and thank you for the kind words, by the way, but it would be really weird if I couldn't meet with people I've had ideological agreements with and like literally break bread, and then immediately after we sat down and had like a beer or something, or we would go back online and have another conversation,
and see what happens, right?
While you're literally at the table with the person. I would wonder what would happen with that. That would be, you could kind of close the loop that way, right?
I think so. And I think the less disembodied we are, the better things are, the better things will become. It's just a matter of making the time for it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the thing. But with that, I think the procrastination stream has to come to an end. Thank you so much, Game Diviner or Paulo, for coming on. I hope I can have you on the channel sometime in the future. I think you're providing a bunch of much needed white pills for people. I sometimes some people say I oppose the alt-right, but I've sold every one of their black pills. And I'm glad you can come on and provide some much needed cheer in this time. I promise, guys, I'm going to get more optimistic, especially after I clear up some of my schedule. So I can afford to make some more content than just end of the evening live streams.
But God knows I need someone on my side who can actually take care of that blind spot, because if anything, I paid a heavy price for being too optimistic on a lot of people. But honestly, I think things are going to get better. It's just a matter of the right people being at the right places, such as yourself, who are speaking their mind and actually getting people to see things differently. And that's going to be the changing point, is people actually talking and not just simply screaming at each other platitudes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope I can have you on the channel again, and maybe we can talk about a more specific topic here. I think I was just trying to introduce my people to your content. So
actually, I don't have any.
Well, I know you're focusing on other things, but I think you have a perspective that's very needed, and so any chance I can have to help you out would be great. But I think we'll have to close out now. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and I'm at your disposal if you really need me to come back and cheer people on.
No, I'll just say good night and Godspeed. So cheers, chat.